In this video, we're going to take a look at Organic Studio's Cobalt Blue. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. When I first did the swatch, for resistance, I was really prepared for a blue that had nothing special to offer the world at all. And the swatch lied. The tone in writing is so much better than can be seen with the swatch. It gives a lot of bold, beautiful blue that really, the shading that comes with it, outstanding. On cheaper paper, it was less impressive, but that's not the ink's fault. I can say that this goes on to my personal list of inks I wouldn't mind having a bottle of. It is a great, solid performing blue that stands out from the crowd, which I don't say that very often for blues because there are so many of them. But this one I've never really heard much of, and yet it should. It is an absolutely gorgeous blue that shouldn't be overlooked. So if you don't mind using blue inks, or especially if you like blue inks, I really recommend giving this one a try. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Diplomat Aero with a broad nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the fine nib, you get a very nice blue. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread. It does offer some shading, and not a ton, but it certainly gives you much darker letters while you're looking at it. From this fine, which is a little drier, it's just a solid blue. Not really the most standout thing, but solid. Looking at the zoom nib, it is much darker than we had with the fine. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread. Its shading looks really good. It shades quite a bit more than we had with the fine, and it goes from a nice bold blue to a very, very dark bold. Beautiful on the page the entire time. Really adds a lot of character to what you've written. And when you write boring things like ink reviews, anything that makes it look better is better. Looking at the music nib, it is about the same tone that we were getting with the zoom, not unexpected. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it shades beautifully. Beautiful tone with beautiful shading. I will say that the Clairfontaine is going to give the best color of what we're going to see in the writing samples, but that's largely because we're about to go towards some less premium papers. Beautiful. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get no bleeding and no real ghosting. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Sailor Pro Gear Slim Mini with a fine nib. A Sailor 1911 Large with a zoom nib. A Sailor 1911 Standard with a music nib. The next writing sample is done in a FieldNotes steno notebook. Looking at the fine nib, it is a lot lighter than we had with the Clairfontaine. Now, we're not getting any feather, we're not getting any spread, we're not getting that beautiful shading. And while it's largely the same tone, it's flatter on this paper, but the paper's more absorbent. Here I would consider it a perfectly acceptable blue, but not necessarily the blue I would run to. So paper is a part of that trifecta. The zoom nib is darker than we had with the fine. The tone is absolutely, really is a blue, it's not good here. I really don't like it. While I like this ink, I don't like this tone with it on this paper. Now, it does have a tiny bit of feathering around, but it's a very wet pen. It does have a little bit of spread, but it's also a zoom nib. There are a couple moments that are darker, but nothing particularly stand out and great. Looking at the music nib, it is a little bit lighter than we had with the zoom. We do get tiny bits of feathering, not the end of the world here. We do get very, very minor spread. It's a music nib and it's wet, so some of that's to be expected. We're really not getting any shading. It's the tone itself that I don't like, but I haven't really liked the tone on any of the nibs on this paper. This ink doesn't go very well with this paper to me. Looking at the back of the page, it is remarkable, but it did not bleed through and touch the page underneath, despite everything that was going on with the zoom and the music. Now, the fine did much better. I think the fine, you could use the back of the page. The other two, it's a lost cause. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done in an AMPAD steno notebook. Looking at the fine nib, I think the tone we're getting here is much better than we had on the last paper. We get no feather, we get no spread, we get no real shading, but the tone itself, like I said, is much better. With this fine, I could live with it without any kind of a problem. So if this is the notepad that you prefer to use, you could use it, but you're not getting the best effect of this ink. I think it's a little affected by the tone of the paper. Looking at the zoom nib, it is, I really want to say, around the same tone that we had with the fine, but it really doesn't look very appealing here. It feathers, it spreads, it doesn't really shade, but the thicker lines that we're getting really bring out the change in the tone from the paper that is not as dynamic as we saw on the Clairfontaine. I wouldn't use it on this, but it's not horrible. Looking at the music nib, we get tiny feathers. They're manageable. We do get a tiny bit of spread. It's very manageable. We get no shading really at all. I think where you see the farther and the T of it cross, it's a little bit darker, but not really shading going on. We have the same tone that we had in the zoom, and it leaves you feeling whelmed. It would work. I wouldn't turn away from it. I just wouldn't run to use it. Looking at the back of the page, we get a ton of ghosting with the zoom and the music, not as much with the fine. And I circled these 3 spots where those did just lightly kiss the page underneath. Yeah, it corrupted the next page, but not unusable. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a National Steno notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we see a tone a little more pleasant than the last paper. The difference in tone of the paper really is helping here. We're not getting any feather. We're not getting any spread. We are getting some spots where we see some shading. You see it in the TS of Giants. You see it in Copernicus in the S and the PER. So it's there. It's not drawing attention away from the writing, but only giving moments to really highlight how nice it can be. Looking at the zoom nib, it is significantly darker than it was with the fine. We're not getting any feather, any spread, and we are getting shading. Now, it's not the same tone that we had with the Clairfontaine, but I definitely see this as a very nice tone on this paper. This paper has very continuously made me very happy with a lot of inks. I think it's a paper people should take a little more look at. The music nib is just a little bit lighter than we had with the zoom. It has no feather. It has no spread. It has moments of shading, but not as many as the zoom nib did. Now, the little bit lighter of this tone I don't think looks as good as it did with the zoom, which is unfortunate for me because I write better with the music than I do with the zoom. Looking at the back of the page, we see that there is some minor ghosting with the zoom and the music, but I think you may get away with using the back of the page. The fine's not a problem. Nothing bled through and touched the page underneath. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Califolio Mediterranean Blue. Here is Diamine Florida Blue. Here is Krishna Causal. Here is Noodler's Liberty's Elysium. The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot Steno notebook. Looking at the fine nib, it's giving a much better tone than we had on the right pad. Now, it has no feather, it has no spread. There are a few moments of shading that goes on. You can definitely notice some spots are lighter than others. It's a very gentle shading in and out, where in the Clairfontaine, it was very quickly much darker and then much lighter. I think this is pretty good for this very cheap paper. The zoom nib is much darker than we got with the fine. I think the tone looks quite a bit better. It doesn't have some of the, I'm going to call it pizzazz, for lack of a better word, than the Clairfontaine, but I think this looks really good. This paper tends to give it a dull look. It has no feathering and it has no spread. Quite the shock. It still shades. Quite the shock for this paper. So while this paper's not been my favorite, it has done very well with this ink. Looking at the music nib, we do see feathering right off the bat in the H of other. You see it right there. Now, it's not like there's tons. You see it a little bit in that. Just the point that there is a little bit of feathering, but far from really being a problem. There's no spread. There are a few moments of shading, but not as much as we had with the zoom nib. And speaking of that comparison, it is a tad bit lighter in tone. Overall, not too bad. Looking at the back of the page, there was no bleed through that touched the page underneath. This paper did fantastic. There is heavy ghosting on the zoom and the music. I think you could, if you wanted to get away with using the back of the page, I think you'd get away with it, and especially you would with the fine. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a pink ink by Pilot, their mixable pink. Here is an orange ink by Noodlers, their Summer Tanager. Here is a magenta ink by Montegrappa, their Fuchsia. Here is a yellow ink by J. Herbin, their Amber de Bermanie. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the fine nib, you can really see how good this ink is. It's holding a nice darker blue, not as nice a tone, but a nice darker blue. There's minor feathering, very minor, very usable. There's almost no spread. There is a tiny bit, but almost none. There's no real shading. Yes, there are a couple darker spots, but I don't really want to call it shading. This is outstanding performance for this paper. Looking at the zoom nib, it is darker than we had with the fine. It is feathering, although manageably. It is spreading, although, again, manageably. You have to write much larger considering that nib and this paper. The tone is not for me, but not horrible. It's just a matter of there's a lot of blues, and if I'm using this paper, this probably isn't the blue for me to use. The music nib has the same tone that we got with the zoom, which I was really expecting, so the tone isn't for me. Its performance, on the other hand, is truly spectacular. It has tiny bits of feathering, but nothing that would be any kind of an issue. If you look closely at the word weight on the top line or the LS in falls on the second line, you see it is some there. It's not really a problem. And we get no shading whatsoever. Not unexpected. Looking at the page underneath, you see a ton of spots where I circled that it did touch the page underneath. These are tiny spots and probably wouldn't stop you from using it. Now the back of the page shows a ton of ghosting, so there is no using the back. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? I like this ink in everything, so it really is a dealer's choice. You get to ink your favorite pen and enjoy. You're going to have a beautiful tone and a very pleasant writing experience. It's going to have to do with the paper. But again, at this point, I'm using a lot of cheaper papers. Take a look at that Clairfontaine again. It is gorgeous. If you want, I would choose a pen, I would go for probably a very wet medium because of the tone and the shading that it would give. There is a little bit of a difference that goes on from one to the other, but I think the very wet medium is going to give me everything that I like about this ink in as many circumstances as possible, because this ink deserves the best. I hope you got something out of this video, and if you want to support the channel, you can over on Patreon. Thanks for watching.